said.
Exactly.
Right, so a lot of people may think that your aristocratic background got you this in, when in fact it was actually your ideas and how you expressed them.
It was my natural genius and ability.
There you go. Yes.
Or something.
But
of course, in all these things, there is luck. Of course there is.
Of course, yes.
And if you look at the chain of circumstances that got me to number 10, it's a series of lucky breaks. Well, no. And so I know the old Latin saying is faber quisque fortunae sui, everyone is the engineer of his own fortune, but I think I have been lucky beyond what most people would have a right to expect.
To go back to your education, was there any particular professor who may have been your mentor or advisor or somebody that you looked up to, influenced you?
Well, I was at Churchill College, Cambridge, which was a very left-wing college, and my tutor there, who was the vice-master of the college, was a bit of a horror, so I didn't get much of use from him. It was always slightly daggers drawn between us. But I think of all the various professors I worked with, Professor Hugh Plummer was a very great man. He was the professor of classical archaeology and gave me my love in particular of classical architecture, and also taught me some of my earliest proper mathematics. I began to realize how influential it was in shaping how the world worked. And so that's where I got mathematics from. And as for politics, that began at Cambridge, but it began really at the Cambridge Union. And that was the debating society, the oldest, I think one of the oldest university debating societies in the world, certainly a lot older than the Oxford Union. And the interesting thing there was that there was a dominant left-wing control of the union at the time, and the left wanted to take away the air of privilege, take away the debate, turn it into just another cafeteria cum commune, like any other student union. And I was against this, and I managed to discover that there was an Act of Parliament that protected institutions of this kind, and that the Cambridge Union had been set up under that Act of Parliament, so that the members had to be consulted in referenda of all the members who had ever been members, as well as who were still members. And so we put out notices and said, come back and vote. And in that vote, they only got a bare majority of 27 votes out of several thousand votes cast. They needed a two-thirds majority, and they needed to do it again a month later, which they clearly weren't going to succeed in doing. So the project failed. And that did two things. One, it taught me that it doesn't matter that you're in the minority, and it doesn't matter what the politics are. In the end, it's the facts that matter. And if you're in the minority, you can still bring the majority to a complete standstill, provided you have the truth on your side, and provided there is some democratic mechanism for making sure that the truth is asserted. And ever since then, I have been very fond of the referendum as a way of consulting people directly on what they want, rather than the top-down approach where the governing class tells them what's good for them.
That seems to fly in the face of your contention that the truth is not a matter of consensus, though.
No, it isn't, and that's a very fair and shrewd question. But what are we asking the people when we ask the people? We're not asking them to decide scientific questions. I mean, you couldn't have a vote to decide whether the Pythagorean theorem is true, or even whether we're going to get dangerous global warming. That would not tell you anything useful, even if it's a vote among scientists. When you have a vote on, for instance, whether the Cambridge Union should remain the Cambridge Union, as it had always been intended to be, whether it should become a cafeteria cum commune, then there what you're asking the members what they want. There is no objective truth there. It's a matter of their choice. And so when you're consulting people in a referendum, you're asking them what they want. And that's the one circumstance in which consensus does matter, because it's the people who know best what is best for the people.
Interesting. Now, you've probably seen over the past 30, 40 years quite a change in educational methods, institutions, the quality of the students, the professors. Do you have any ideas, perhaps, about how any of these changes may have been responsible for the ease with which people seem to accept what, to many of us, considered to be incorrect or even immoral? Is it the educational institutions that are to blame on this?
Let's first of all define what we might mean by what's incorrect or immoral. I think there are a number of
those things which fly in the face of logic, reason, science, truth.
And I think the global warming thing is a very good example of that, because here is a potential problem that's been magnified beyond all reason, and long before we actually need to take any steps to do anything about it, when there are much more immediate and real problems facing our poorer fellow citizens in places like Africa. They need our help now, and they're not basically getting it. So what has happened to the educational standards? Well, there has been a decline. I think it's been a rather sad decline. It's been a very rapid decline. To some extent, in my more feverish moments, I think it's been an organised decline. Every generation from the Middle Ages until my generation was taught 3 subjects before they could approach higher education. You had to be taught grammar, which I had practically beaten into me at my prep school, so that I really understood how the English language hung together. So that I knew the pathway of thought, that is language. There are only 2 pathways of thought, really. One is language and the other is mathematics, which is itself a kind of language and a very concise, precise and logical one. But language is the pathway of thought, so you have to start by really understanding how your language hangs together, grammar. The second of the 3 elements in the medieval trivium, as it was called, was logic. And this was how to think straight. Once you've got the language under your belt, how do you think straight? How do you think in a way, in such a way that you start an argument with a series of declarative statements or premises, and do those premises validly entail the conclusion of your argument? That's what logic is all about. And then, of course, if the premises are true and they validly entail the conclusion of the argument, then the argument itself is sound because its conclusion must be true. And I was taught logic. Everybody was. That was part of what you did before you went to university. And the third element in the medieval trivium, which was taught all the way from the Middle Ages until my generation, but not thereafter, was rhetoric. Once you have done your language and you've understood that, and you've done your logic and you've understood that, then how do you express yourself using your language in a logical fashion, but in a way which is going to commend your argument to those to whom you're addressing it? And this is not just in speech. It might be in an essay, it might be in a book, it might be in a newspaper article, it might be in a leading article, it might be in a sonnet. We were taught all these things. How to express yourself once you have had the necessary training in what it is you're trying to say, to make sure that you say it elegantly and straight.
Do you think it's fair to say that once you've learned those 3 elemental pieces of knowledge and skills, that a person can, with such a classical education, go on to be anything they want to be?
Well, let me tell you a little story about that. Yes, when Harold Macmillan went up to Oxford to study the classics, of course he too, by that stage, had already studied grammar and logic and rhetoric. His tutor said to him, "You're here for 4 years, it's a long course at Oxford, it's 3 years at Cambridge, but they take longer to learn this stuff at Oxford, so it's 4 years there." And so his tutor said to him, "You will spend 4 years studying matters which are going to serve you with no usefulness at all in your future life. They have no value whatsoever, vocationally speaking, except in one respect," he said, "you will recognize rot when you hear it." And that is what a classical education does. It gives you such a training that you are able to think very clearly indeed.
Now, from the changes in education, from such a classical education to
yes.
rather mess that we have today, if I could editorialize.
Yes.
Journalism. You were trained as a journalist. Now, did you see any difference in the methods or the skills of a journalist from your era to the ones of today?
A huge change. First of all, when you mention a journalist of my era, you begin to remind me that age is creeping up on me. But yes, there's been an enormous change. And I think we need to go back to that medieval trivium just for a moment to illustrate how important this change that's happened is. See, the medieval trivium was also rooted in Christian theology, because the three subjects of the trivium, grammar and logic and rhetoric, mirrored the three, and indeed informed the three powers and developed the three powers of the Christian soul, which are the memory, the use of reason, and the will. And there's parallels between the three. They're quite obvious. I don't need to describe them further. In other words, education was regarded as something which had a moral purpose, so that one could learn to think in a moral way, that thinking and speaking truly had a moral value. It was something that was not just expedient or convenient or profitable to do. It was right to do things that way, and one should not depart from the truth. And therefore, carrying this into journalism and your question, my job as a journalist, if I was sent, shall we say, to report a political meeting, was to report what was said at the meeting. Had there been a meeting on global warming, it didn't matter what side I was on this debate. I would go to that meeting. If it was somebody on one side or somebody on the other, it didn't matter to me. My job was to take down in shorthand what they said, to mark in the margin as I went through the bits I thought would be interesting, and then summarize those and condense it all into an informative article which fully and fairly reflected what the speaker had actually said. At no point in this process was there any room for editorial comment at all. That was not my job as a news reporter. You started by just answering A.J.P. Taylor's question, which is the title of his essay on history. The job of the historian and of the journalist who is writing history as it happens in an article when he's a reporter is to answer the question, what happened next? Not to editorialize about it, not to give his own views about it, not to push the argument in one direction or another, or to be snide about the speaker or distort what they said, but just to report it.
That doesn't sound like a lot of journalism that I read today.
No, that's what's changed. Nowadays, journalists are nearly all from one narrow, rather poisonous political faction. I will call them bluntly Marxists. They are there to push their own political agenda to the exclusion of all others. They will not report any facts that are inconvenient to their point of view or that go against the storyline or the party line. They would call it a consensus, I call it the party line. And journalism has now just become an extension of politics. It's no surprise, therefore, that the subscriptions to newspapers are plummeting, and fewer and fewer people watch the mainstream television channels. Why? Because they're not going to get the news straight anymore. They're not going to be given the facts, so why should they waste their time reading endless pages of Marxist drivel? And even if you are a Marxist, it must get pretty boring, because you're never hearing the facts, so that you can form your own opinion. And in general, what I think has begun to happen in education as well is that whereas we were encouraged to learn enough facts to understand what we were looking at, but then to use our own judgment and think for ourselves, now they're taught not to do that. They are taught only to reflect the party line. I'd like to give